Alfred Lord Tennyson. In his own lifetime, Tennyson was the most popular of poets. His works, from 1850 onward, occupied a significant space on the bookshelves of almost every family of readers in England and the United States. Such popularity inevitably provoked a reaction in the decades following his death. In the course of repudiating their Victorian predecessors, the Edwardians and Georgians established the fashion of making fun of Tennyson's achievements. Samuel Butler, 1835 to 1902, who, anticipating early 20th century 1900 tastes, has a characteristic entry in his notebook. Talking it over, we agreed that Blake was no good because he learned Italian at 60 in order to study Dante, and we knew Dante was no good because he was so fond of Virgil, and Virgil was no good because Tennyson followed him, and as for Tennyson, well, Tennyson goes without saying. Butler's flippant dismissal expresses an attitude that is no longer fashionable. Tennyson's stature as one of the major poets of the English language seems uncontroversial today. Like his poetry, Tennyson's life and character have been reassessed in recent times. To many of his contemporaries, he seemed a remote wizard, secure in his laureate's robes, a man whose life had been all sheltered, marred only by the loss of his best friend in youth. During much of his career, Tennyson may have been isolated, but his was not a sheltered life in the real sense of the word. His childhood home, a parsonage, was a household dominated by frictions and loyalties and broodings over ancestral inheritances, in which the children showed marked strains of instability and eccentricity. Alfred Tennyson was the fourth son in a family of 12 children. One of his brothers had to be confined to an insane asylum for life. Another was long addicted to opium. Another had violent quarrels with his father, the Reverend Dr. George Tennyson. This father, a man of considerable learning, had been born the eldest son of a wealthy landowner and had, therefore, expected to be heir to his family's estates. Instead, he was disinherited in favor of his younger brother and had to make his own livelihood by joining the clergy, a profession that he disliked. After George Tennyson had settled in a small rectory in Somersby, his brooding sense of dissatisfaction led to increasingly violent bouts of drunkenness. He was nevertheless able to act as his son's tutor in classical and modern languages to prepare them for entering the university. Before leaving this strange household for Cambridge, Tennyson had already demonstrated a flair for writing verse, precocious exercises in the manner of John Milton or Byron or the Elizabethan dramatists. He had even published a volume in 1827, in collaboration with his brother Charles, Poems by Two Brothers. This feat drew him to the attention of a group of gifted undergraduates at Cambridge, the Apostles, who encouraged him to devote his life to poetry. Up until that time, the young man had known scarcely anyone outside the circle of his own family. Despite his massive fame and powerful physique, he was painfully shy, and the friendships he found at Cambridge, as well as the intellectual and political discussions in which he participated, gave him confidence and widened his horizons as a poet. The most important of these friendships was with Arthur Hallam, a leader of the Apostles, who later became engaged to Tennyson's sister Emily. Hallam's sudden death in 1833 seemed an overwhelming calamity to his friend. Not only the long elegy In Memoriam, 1850, but many of Tennyson's other poems are tributes to this early friendship. Tennyson's career at Cambridge was interrupted and finally broke off in 1831 by family dissensions and financial need, and he returned home to study and practice the craft of poetry. His early volumes, 1830 and 1832, were attacked as obscure or affected by some of the reviewers. Tennyson suffered acutely under hostile criticism, but he also profited from it. His 1842 volume demonstrated a remarkable leap forward, and in 1850 he at last attained fame and full critical recognition with In Memoriam. In the same year he became poet laureate in succession to William Wordsworth. The struggle during the previous 20 years had been made especially painful by the long postponement of his marriage to Emily Selwood, whom he had loved since 1836, but could not marry because of poverty until 1850. His life thereafter was a comfortable one. He was as popular as Byron had been, and the earnings from his poetry, sometimes exceeding £10,000 a year, enabled him to purchase a house in the country and to enjoy the kind of seclusion he liked. His notoriety was enhanced, like that of Bernard Shaw and Walt Whitman, by his colorful appearance. Huge and shaggy in cloak and broad-brimmed hat, gruff in manner, he impressed everyone as what is called a character. The pioneering photographer Julia Cameron, who took magnificent portraits of him, called him the most beautiful old man on earth. Like Dylan Thomas in the 20th century, 1900s, Tennyson had a booming voice that electrified listeners when he read his poetry, mouthing out his hollow O's and A's, deep-chested music, as he would covertly describe himself in an early version of his Arthurian epic. Moreover, for many Victorian readers, he seemed not only a great poetical phrase-maker and a striking individual, but also a wise man whose occasional pronouncements on politics or world affairs represented the national voice itself. In 1884, he accepted a peerage. In 1892, he died and was buried in Westminster Abbey. It is often said that success was bad for Tennyson and that after In Memoriam, his poetic power seriously declined. That in his last 42 years, certain of his mannerisms became accentuated is true. One of the difficulties of his dignified blank verse was, as he said himself, that it is hard to describe commonplace objects and, at the same time, to retain poetical elevation. This difficulty is evident, for example, in Enoch Arden, 1864, a long blank verse narrative of everyday life in a fishing village, in which a basket full of fish is ornately described as Enoch's ocean spoil, an ocean-smelling osier. In his later poems dealing with national affairs, there is also an increased shrillness of tone, a mannerism accentuated by Tennyson's realizing that he, like Charles Dickens, had a vast public behind him to back up his pronouncements. It would be unwise, however, to ignore all of Tennyson's later productions. In 1855, he published his experimental monologue Maud, in which he presents an alienated hero who feels great bitterness toward society. In 1859 appeared 4 books of his Idylls of the King, a large-scale epic that occupied most of his energies in the second half of his career. The Idylls uses the body of Arthurian legend to construct a vision of civilization's rise and fall. In this civilization, women both inspire men's highest efforts and sow the seeds of those efforts' destruction. The Idylls provides Tennyson's most extensive social vision, one that typifies much social thought of the age in its concern with medieval ideals of social community, heroism, and courtly love, and in its despairing sense of the cycles of historical change. W. H. Auden stated that Tennyson had the finest ear, perhaps, of any English poet. The interesting point is that Tennyson did not have such an ear, he developed it. Studies of the original versions of his poems in the 1830 and 1832 volumes demonstrate how hard he worked at his craftsmanship. Like Geoffrey Chaucer or Alexander Pope or John Keats, Tennyson studied his predecessors assiduously to perfect his technique. Anyone wanting to learn the traditional craft of English verse can study profitably the various stages of revision that poems such as The Lotus Eaters were subjected to by this painstaking and artful poet. Some lines written in 1988 by the American poet Carl Shapiro effectively characterize Tennyson's accomplishments in these areas. Long lived the very image of English poet, whose songs still break out tears in the generations, whose poetry for practitioners still astounds, who crafted his life and letters like a watch. Tennyson's early poetry shows other skills as well. One of these was a capacity for linking scenery to states of mind. As early as 1835, J.S. Mill identified the special kind of scene painting to be found in poems such as Mariana, 1830. Not the power of producing that rather vapid species of composition usually termed descriptive poetry, but the power of creating scenery, in keeping with some state of human feeling so fitted to it as to be the embodied symbol of it, and to summon up the state of feeling itself, with a force not to be surpassed by anything but reality. The state of feeling to which Tennyson was most intensely drawn was a melancholy isolation, often portrayed through the consciousness of an abandoned woman, as in Mariana. Tennyson's absorption with such emotions in his early poetry evoked considerable criticism. His friend R.C. Trench warned him, "Tennyson, we cannot live in art," and Mill urged him to cultivate, and with no half devotion, philosophy as well as poetry. Advice of this kind Tennyson was already predisposed to heed. The death of Hallam and the religious uncertainties that he had himself experienced, together with his own extensive study of writings by geologists, astronomers, and biologists, led him to confront many of the religious issues that bewildered his and later generations. The result was In Memoriam, a long elegy written over a period of 17 years, embodying the poet's reflections on the relation of human beings to God and to nature. Tennyson's exploration of these vast subjects prompted some readers, such as T.H. Huxley, to consider him an intellectual giant, a thinker who had mastered the scientific thought of his century and fully confronted the issues it raised. Others dismissed Tennyson in this phase as a lightweight. Auden went so far as to call him the stupidest of English poets. He added, "There was little about melancholia that he didn't know. There was little else that he did." Perhaps T.S. Eliot's evaluation of In Memoriam is the more thought-provoking. The poem he wrote is remarkable not because of the quality of its faith, but because of the quality of its doubt. Tennyson's mind was slow, ponderous, brooding. For the composition of In Memoriam, such qualities of mind were assets, not liabilities. Very different are the poems Tennyson writes of events of the moment over which his thoughts and feelings have had no time to brood. Several of these are what he himself called newspaper verse. They are letters to the editor, in effect, with the heat we expect of such productions. The Charge of the Light Brigade, 1854, inspired by a report in the London Times of a cavalry charge at Balaclava during the Crimean War, is one of the most fascinating of his productions in this category. Tennyson's poems of contemporary events were inevitably popular in his own day. So too were those poems in which, as in Locksley Hall, 1842, he dipped into the future. The technological changes wrought by Victorian inventors and engineers fascinated him, sometimes giving him an exultant assurance of human progress. At other times, the horrors of industrialism's byproducts in the slums, the persistence of barbarity and bloodshed, and the greed of the newly rich destroyed his hopes that humanity was evolving upward. In the final book of Idylls of the King, 1869, Arthur laments that his realm reels back into the beast. Tennyson was similarly haunted by the possibility of retrogression. For despite Tennyson's fascination with technological developments, he was essentially a poet of the countryside, a man whose whole being was conditioned by the recurring rhythms of rural rather than urban life. He had the country dweller's awareness of traditional roots and sense of the past. It is appropriate that so many of his poems are about the past, not about the present or future. Tennyson said that the words "far, far away" had always a strange charm for him, even in his childhood. He was haunted by what he called the passion of the past. The past became his great theme, whether it be his own past, such as the times he shared with Hallam, his country's past, as in Idylls of the King, or the past of the world itself, as expressed in these lines from In Memoriam. There rolls the deep where grew the tree, O earth, what changes hast thou seen? There where the long street roars has been the stillness of the central sea. Though Tennyson more often is inspired by the recorded past of humankind, he is the first major writer to express this awareness of the vast extent of geological time that has haunted human consciousness since Victorian scientists exposed the history of the Earth's crust.